All right. Got the clicker. Thank you for showing up to this talk at the very last session of RightsCon. Hope you've all had a wonderful conference. I'm sure it's been as rich and busy as mine has. So this is Beyond Encryption. It's a talk about nation-state espionage directed at the human rights community and NGOs.
All right, I bet you're all wondering who I am. Hi, my name is Eva Galperin. I'm a global policy analyst for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I work on EFF's international team, where I spend most of my time worried about the privacy and security of vulnerable populations like journalists and activists, and journalists in places where it's basically activism.
Yeah, and I'm Morgan Marquis-Bois. I'm currently the Director of Security at First Look Media, who publishes The Intercept. I also am a security researcher at the Citizen Lab, where I produce research at the sort of intersection of digital security and human rights, and I also advise Amnesty International, EFF, Freedom of Press Foundation, and a variety of other NGOs on security issues.
So Morgan and I have been working together with a whole bunch of other people on sort of the issue of protecting journalists and activists and people at NGOs for several years now. We occasionally like to refer to ourselves as the Super Friends. Mostly we argue over who has to be Aquaman. I would like to believe that I am Wonder Woman, but I am clearly whatever tiny blue-haired girl is at the bottom of this slide. And what do we do together? Well, probably the thing that takes most of our time is sort of outreach, community relations, and trust building. It is really hard to convince journalists and activists to let you onto their computers or their devices or to send you their malware if they don't know you and they don't trust you and they are scared. We also do incident response, which is the kind of nitty-gritty of, we do forensics, malware analysis, threat intelligence, the kind of stuff that professional security people do all day long. We also do education. I spend a lot of my time doing trainings for NGOs, for individuals in scary situations, for freelance journalists, for media organizations. I actually just got back from Doha, where I did a training with Jillian York at the IPI conference, and people had a lot of very interesting misconceptions about privacy and security online. So we try to dispel those. We also do policy research. So some of the work that we do ends up having implications for what companies should be doing, what governments should be doing. For example, our research has resulted in some changes at the policy level in the Wassenaar arrangement, which I can discuss at length at a different time in a different talk. And I also make use of EFF's vast and powerful legal department. For example, one of the things that EFF has done is sued the state of Ethiopia when we caught them spying on an activist living in Washington, D.C. And we are of the opinion that if you spy on somebody in Washington, D.C., on their computer in D.C., and you are violating the wiretapping statute in the United States, then we should be able to sue you. And that's what we've been doing for, I think, about the last 1.5 to 2 years, because the wheels of justice move slowly. We also do a lot of follow-up. Basically, once somebody's computer has been compromised or something has happened to it, very often security researchers are like, I have your sweet, sweet malware. I'm gone. All I want to do is write threat reports. But the people who have been compromised want to know, is my computer safe to use? Can I log into my email? Is it okay to contact my friends or my relatives again? And so we spend some time kind of making people whole after that. We spent about 1.5 to 2 years going around to conferences, giving what we nicknamed the We Could Be Heroes talk. We're definitely very prescient in our Bowie worship over here. And what I did was I went around to InfoSec conferences, I described what we were doing, and I said, listen, these wonderful skills that you people have as InfoSec professionals could be used to help people on the ground in dangerous situations. And frequently the stuff that's being used to target them is not very sophisticated, so you don't even have to do like a whole lot of really hard work. So come and join us. And this was a colossal failure, and Morgan will now tell you why.
Yeah, and so one of the things is that, as Eva has so clearly articulated, there's a lot of moving parts to doing this type of work. Now, of course, when she or I have talked to the InfoSec community, what people hear is a bit in red, right? Which, interestingly enough, is actually the most clearly articulated and contained part of this whole thing, in that you get a binary, a sample, and you analyze it, and then you're done. And this is great, actually, because engineers really like contained bits of work, right? Like, okay, I'm going to do some free work for you. How long will it take? When will I know that I'm done? Very sane questions. Unfortunately, it's sort of, a piece of all of this stuff. And so it's sort of explaining to people that actually doing this work involves a lot of sort of frustrating, open-ended endeavors. Has meant that a lot of people have found it very difficult to engage, especially because it's difficult to consume someone's spare time when they say, okay, I'll give you 2 hours a week on a Sunday. It's like, well, sure, that's great, but it's a little more difficult than that. So, as you've noticed, lots of moving parts. Frequently, we encapsulate this under the sort of rubric of protecting high-risk users. So what is a high-risk user? In our work, we've primarily focused on, activists, journalists, and human rights researchers, which is largely because, it sort of helps with the asymmetry problem. These are frequently people that don't have security teams, don't have access to security advice. Security consultancy is very expensive, and so, unless they actually get it for free, they're unlikely to get it at all. Obviously, not all people engaged in this type of work are equally at risk. The yardstick that I've sort of explained to people is like, sort of, how targeted are you by a nation state? On a scale of 0 to Edward Snowden, there's sort of quite a lot in between being sort of the most wanted man by the most powerful spy agency in the world, and someone who is actually doing great work in human rights research. There's steps and scales. So what we're going to talk about today is primarily the targeting of NGOs and human rights organizations by nation-state attackers. This has been going on for some time. One of the first reports on this type of activity was done by Citizen Lab in 2009, and it was called GhostNet. And because it is OG, we have a picture of Ghostface Killer there. And so this report largely detailed hacking by presumably the Chinese government against organizations and NGOs around the world, including the Dalai Lama, in 103 different countries. Somewhat more recently, there's also quite a high-profile case that you guys might have heard of. So this woman is named Ala Shahabi, and she was the co-founder of Bahrain Watch. She was targeted using this malware called Finfisher, which sort of gained notoriety during the Arab Spring when the Egyptian state intelligence was ransacked and people had found that this German-British entity had been selling what they described as a kit for governmental intrusion to the Egyptian government.
The way that this whole thing kind of started was that, so here I am, sitting around, reading Slate, because Slate was still readable at the time, and I read an article which is about a guy, some activist in Morocco who had apparently had malware installed on his computer. The article does not get specific about what activist it was or what kind of malware it was, but it does allege that this was sent out by the Moroccan government. And so I rack my brain and I think, who do I know in Morocco who's an activist? And my first thought is Hisham al-Murat, who is one of the founders of an organization called Mamfakench, with whom I had just gone to a conference in Porto, Portugal. And in an amazing coincidence, as it happens, he is the person who was targeted with this malware. So I reach out to him. I say, hey, have you heard about this story? He goes, yes, it's me. And he sends me the sample. I send the sample to Morgan. He does an analysis. And we later discover that that this was all run by, yes, that this is the Moroccan government, and also that this is software produced by a company called Hacking Team, which we'll talk about in a moment. One of the interesting sort of results of this particular intrusion is that a number of Moroccan activists who were public about having had their privacy invaded and having been surveilled using this software by the Moroccan government were later sued and are currently being sued by the Moroccan government for a variety of reasons, including adultery and also posing a threat to the state. Hisham Al-Marat is among them and currently is unable to return to Morocco.
Yeah. So, as mentioned, the software that was used to hack Mamfakinch, and we sort of use the phrase as this was targeted, and they were, but their organization was actually compromised, and so they received a bait document which promised an entertaining and juicy scandal on behalf sort of about the government. Various members of the organization opened this, and this spyware was installed in their organization, which allowed the Moroccan government to sort of read their communications, sort of track their movements, and so forth. And so Hacking Team, who sold the software to the Moroccan government, sort of gained a reasonable amount of notoriety for selling this type of capability to all sorts of entertaining governments around the world, including a bunch who sort of rate reasonably low on human rights indexes. Their software was also used to compromise the computer of this man, Ahmed Mansour, who was an advisor to Human Rights Watch in the Middle East. He was a pro-democracy activist that the UAE government had imprisoned for signing a pro-democracy petition. He was released after a couple of years. His views on democracy hadn't really changed, and neither had his government's views on him. And so what happened is that he was giving various lectures, attending various sort of talks and groups, and he was being followed, and he was being savagely beaten by groups of men that would sort of jump out of vans, and he had no idea how they were actually able to track his location and figure out where he was and what he was up to. And so he was put in contact with me, and I performed forensics on his computer and found that his computer had been compromised, and this was actually how the government was being made aware of his movements and his communications, and that they were tracking him, and they were reading his emails, and this was how he was sort of being regularly assaulted. It all started when he was actually sent a Microsoft Word document, which he opened under the belief that, it was probably benign. So I mean, the incidents that we just sort of mentioned sort of happened, during the Arab Spring, which is obviously, sort of a time of some conflict. However, this sort of occurs, around the world. This particular campaign, which there's a map behind me, has been going on for 8 years in Latin America. There were a number of different groups targeted, including various journalists, one of whom is in this room, including government agencies, NGOs. And another journalist here. So this organization, Fundamedios, is a digital rights organization based out of Ecuador, and they were repeatedly targeted, I think, sort of something like 37 times over a period of years by this specific South American-based actor.
All right, so in our notes, what this says is that government spying on NGOs is not just a problem for brown people. But to expand on this a little bit, this is a slide talking about the FBI's sort of long-standing surveillance campaign against the ACLU, which began in 1920 and continued through the 1970s. So really this is sort of a point about how you think of this as being a problem that is located in the Middle East, or that this is something that's happening in South America, but this is something that the US government does as well. And it's also something that happens to US-based organizations. For example, Human Rights Watch, based in New York, had a problem where their website was compromised by the SCA. The SCA put up a bunch of messages. The organization itself was also compromised, and this is sort of the write-up of how that went. Their Twitter feed was also hijacked. Here, I think we're going to tell a little story about how I am the world's laziest security researcher. Among the organizations that have been targeted, I would include EFF. So once upon a time, I do a lot of work with Vietnamese organizations and especially Viet Thanh. I have done a lot of work on sort of supporting the freeing of bloggers who have been jailed in Vietnam. And so my name is on a lot of outraged Vietnam-related blog posts. One day, I got an email that looked like it was from Oxfam, or from a person who worked at Oxfam, saying we would really like to invite you to a conference in Asia, and for more details about this conference, we would really like you to click on this link. Here we have me assuming my final form, and also a tasty bowl of pho in order to represent Vietnam. And what happened was I took a look at this. I said, this is clearly malware. And I sent it to Morgan for analysis. Also targeted was April Glazer, who's a former employee at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who had written a single blog post about freeing Vietnamese bloggers that I had not had time to write myself. So for those of you who would like to know how low the bar is for being targeted by the Vietnamese government, it is very low indeed. And we were able to connect this particular attack to attacks on a mathematician who also did this kind of activism, located, I think, in Australia, and also an activist in Southern California. So it was really kind of part of a years-long campaign. Just in case you think that this is sort of something that happened to EFF only once. Pictured here is EFF's own Jillian York looking shocked at a photo of Colin Anderson. And Jillian received an email that looked, again, like it was from a journalist, included an attachment that the journalist would like her to open. Jillian, being a smart person who has done many security trainings, said, "Ha, I'm not opening this thing," and wrote back to the journalist and said, "Well, that's very interesting, but I don't open strange attachments." The journalist then called her on the phone and harangued her to open the attachment. He called her a total of 32 times, demanding that she open this thing, which surely was not suspicious. Again, we sent the sample for analysis to Morgan, who does all the analysis in the world, and we found that this was malware designed to track keystrokes, take photos, record voice, all kinds of things. So that was exciting.
Yeah. So, and additionally, it's not just, there's sort of, the usual suspects, the Chinese and the Iranians, and there's sort of a lot of chest beating about this frequently in the US press, frequently with the word cyber sprinkled liberally in the article. However, I mean, in this case, Amnesty International, in the UK found out that they had actually their communications have been captured by their own government. Specifically by the GCHQ in the UK. They're currently suing over this. Now, this brings me to an interesting point, which is that frequently it's actually very difficult to conclusively attribute who's doing this type of thing to NGOs. So there are innumerable cases where NGOs know that they've been targeted by someone or something, but it's actually very difficult to come forward about it because you don't know who. It's very difficult to understand the nature of the incident and the actors behind it. And so there are actually many incidents where they haven't really been well publicized because sort of the final outcome isn't well known. So in the one above, CPJ was targeted by an actor who I thought at the time looked a lot like China. I was unable to do last yard attribution. And so, Danny O'Brien, wrote a post about it, but again, we couldn't conclusively say that, who it was that was targeting CPJ. Again, frequently organizations get targeted and no one really hears about it. And there's a variety of reasons for this. Frequently, people in the NGO community don't actually want to come forward about being targeted due to sort of perceived reputational loss, difficulty presenting what has happened, sort of lack of expertise to analyze it. They simply don't notice is another common one. So in this case, I'd like to thank Joe from CDT, who several years ago suspected that CDT had been targeted by China. And he sent me malware, and I analyzed it, and it was actually, in this case, it was indeed China. In fact, it was very canonically China. And I never wrote a report about it, and CDT never publicized it, and I actually asked Joe if I could use this for the purposes of illustrating how broad the targeting was sort of against the NGO community, and he's like, yeah, actually, sure, go ahead. And so there's actually a lot of cases like this where people have been targeted, but for some reason don't want to come forward. So thank you, CDT, for agreeing to on this one. And so, obviously, this is the tip of the iceberg. These are occasions where people have noticed, and also occasions where we've actually managed to get some sort of concrete picture about what's actually occurred, who's been behind it. This is frequently not the case. And so, I'd say much like the iceberg, there's a kind of a small amount below the surface, but there is a vast amount of targeting occurring in the NGO community that goes sort of unnoticed, unreported.
So let's talk a little bit about what you need to do if you are running an NGO and you like to stir up trouble and you piss off nation states. If you are an organization that has people on the ground in scary places where the possibility of their being compromised could result in physical harm, in being tortured, in being killed, then you need to seriously consider the possibility that you need a full-time security team. It is not enough to rely on the super friends. You actually need the Justice League. Furthermore, your team needs a budget. I am familiar with the sort of joke that Cindy Cohen makes at EFF, which is that lawyers are constantly walking up to her and they're saying, I'd really like to work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And she says, well, think about this for a moment. Take your paycheck. Divide it up into 3 parts. Burn 2 of them. That remaining bit is what you're going to be paid. And suddenly they reconsider. The same thing is true in the security community. Security professionals are expensive. They cost hundreds of dollars an hour. Their time is literally money. And NGOs are not eager to pay them what they are worth. And so the kind of people that you can get to go work as a security professional at your NGO are going to be the kind of people who either have very committed sort of political views, who have already made their money, or who are possibly not very good. And I'm not naming names, yes. As a person who runs an NGO, you may not be in a position to figure out which one you have. So pay your security people. Pay them market rates. Furthermore, your team is going to need a budget. Your team is going to come in and they're going to tell you, you're going to need to buy some hardware. You need to be able to see what's going on your network. We want everybody to be using the same hardware on the ground. We want everybody to be using the same phones. We want to be able to push updates and limit what people can do on their devices. Your security team is going to be super unpopular, and they need to be given phenomenal cosmic power. Itty bitty living space. So they're going to do a whole lot of really unpopular stuff, and you should roll with it. This stuff is important, and it is especially important if the sort of big outcome of your failing to do this is that you are going to have people die. And if you need to go make the argument to your board of directors or to whoever controls the money that you need to spend this kind of money on securing your NGO, and they say, well, we could hire half a dozen extra activists with this money, just tell them, well, how do you feel about those activists being dead? So let's talk a little bit about what the NGO community is actually doing. All right, so this is a little mean. A lot of the NGOs are running around giving privacy and security advice to people, and that includes the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Frequently, we tell people to encrypt all the things. We're very excited about getting people to use PGP and Tor. Maybe not PGP, maybe sometimes not even Tor, but what we do is we tell people that in-transit encryption is great, and this is great as a tool against mass surveillance, but it's really not that helpful against targeted surveillance, and often we fail to make that point. There is also an entire industry of people who run around giving trainings, and sometimes those trainings are about protection from mass surveillance, and much less often, these trainings are talking about what to do if you are the target of a nation state. And finally, there's a whole lot of money, for some strange reason, in writing secure messaging apps and Tor routers, and not a whole lot in securing endpoints, because right now, that's not very sexy.
Right. So, I mean, this is kind of what I imagine that the landscape looks like. There's sort of a bunch of people writing tools, and they sort of claim, like, this will protect you from cartoon spies, or real spies. I mean, it would be kind of cool if a secure messaging tool claimed to protect you from cartoons, but it's not the case. Unfortunately, the issue with this is that, as Eva pointed out, encryption is great at securing your communications as they travel across the internet, securing them at rest on your computer in case of seizure. They don't do a lot for you if your device or your organization is compromised. And so there's kind of like a conflation of the threat landscape that occurs. I think that the problem is actually poorly articulated, and it is frequently poorly articulated by people who don't well understand it themselves. So for instance, people aren't necessarily that great at threat modeling natively, right? Like we worry a lot about terrorists and not a lot about drunk drivers and heart attacks. We fear that which is novel and new and that which gets a lot of press attention. And so, for instance, this is definitely the fault of the security community and the security press, in that every time we learn about a new capability, and it's exciting because it's some spy stuff, right? And we learn about a new capability of a sort of a top tier nation state, and people get very worried about it. And so, for instance, I receive a lot of communications from people worried about being spied on. And they frequently ask me to help them out by examining their digital devices or sort of analyzing something. The amount of times I am asked to sort of check to see if the NSA has backdoored someone's BIOS or compromised the baseband on their cellular phone. Sort of my sort of somewhat glib response is like, would you notice if you'd opened a bad email in the last 3 months? And the answer is, of course, always no. But people are obviously very concerned about the magic tricks that they hear that it's possible for sort of spy agencies to do, rather than some of the more mundane problems. Which is interesting because nation states, even the very sophisticated ones, field teams of differing capabilities. The A team, which has all of the whizzy tools, toys, and magic tricks, is frequently used to target top-tier adversaries. And so we're talking people with security teams, military installations, politicians, and so forth. Rarely activists and journalists, because these people do not have security teams, so they don't actually necessarily need to warrant the A teams, which actually means that targeted attackers frequently cast their nets very broadly, and they have very good understanding of the possibility of success, because of course these are methodical actors. They have meetings, they understand metrics, and so they may send out 2,000 phishing emails, understanding that they will probably get a sort of a 0.5% return. And what this means is that you can actually, in some ways, sort of effectively price yourself out of the range of certain tiers of people who attack NGOs and so forth. And so several years ago, there was a talk on sort of cyber war and targeted capability given by a man called Dave Vitale, who's quite well known in the security industry. Now, what he did is he broke down targets of espionage, targets of nation-state attackers, into 4 basic groups. There are people that do not have security teams, and this is what I've called everybody. So by and large, most people don't have security teams. This makes you an easy target. If you do not have a security team, you're a comparably easy target. The second tier, as he described, was kind of the hardened enterprise, right? And so these are people who have security teams. They have the ability to sort of control and understand their environments up to a certain level. And then sort of beyond that, you have sort of military installations. Now, of course, they have sweeping powers to mandate exactly who gets access to what and what their environment looks like. And sweeping powers to impose massive inconvenience on people. And then, of course, the final tier of targets that he described are things that sort of run non-standard operating systems and operate non-standardly. For instance, submarines, satellites, nuclear centrifuges, all very interesting targets that require sort of extensive creativity in order to sort of compromise, target, and control. So the metric for these types of attackers looks a little like this. Whether or not a target gets compromised is sort of based on the following calculus. It's based on the amount of resources that an attacker has versus the difficulty of compromising the target versus how desirable the target is. Unless, of course, you're dealing with are less reasonable actors. So nation states, as I said, people have meetings, there's committees, they have budgets, frequently governed by the rule of law, all of this sort of thing. If you are unlucky enough to have irritated a black hat, or someone for whom the reason why they are targeting you is personal or ideological, the similar calculuses don't really apply. Frequently, their motivations are simply to make you miserable, and you have a completely different set of problems. What we're mainly talking about, and as you can see, is the list of people is sort of targeting by sort of a vastly more resourced, but actually also a more methodical state actor. Now, this type of activity sort of sprung into popular consciousness sort of late 2009, early 2010, when Google came forward about being compromised by the Chinese government. Now, it turned out that, this kind of opened up a whole can of worms because it was revealed that Google was not alone. Google was like, well, we were hacked and we think it was China. And then Adobe kind of like, we were also hacked and we think it was China. And then Yahoo put up their hand like, we were also hacked and we think it was China. And then Juniper put up their hand and went, we were also hacked and we think, and you get the idea. Now, something very similar actually happened in the media industry. You guys might remember that the New York Times had a big splashy front page where they revealed that they had been compromised by the Chinese government. And then the Washington Post put up their hand and said we were also compromised by the Chinese government. And then Forbes put up their hand and so on and so forth. And then, of course, all of this happened again when the Syrian Electronic Army came around and they sort of compromised the Associated Press's Twitter account and claimed that Barack Obama had been killed in a bombing, and it just tanked the NASDAQ massively for about 5 minutes. And then they went through and compromised the New York Times and the Washington Post and sort of all the other news organizations. And one of the things that has happened is this has sort of led to sort of a sea change in thinking in these industries. The technology industry has sort of drastically scaled up its efforts to keep out these types of attackers. A lot of information is shared about these attacker activities, and for better or for worse, there are now a lot of products which claim to be able to help you stop these attackers for big money. One of the last things I did before I left Google, sort of where I worked on the security team for 6 years, was together with a colleague, Shane Huntley, we wrote a paper on the targeting of media and journalists by nation-state attackers. And this paper showed that 21 out of 25 of the world's top news organizations had been targeted by state actors. That's a highly significant percentage. And so as you can see, technology industry, media industry, both of these industries have responded better and worse.
Which brings us to you, NGO-landia. As you can see from earlier in our presentation, NGOs are regularly compromised, and they very rarely talk about it for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with simply not noticing, but some of which also have to do with a fear that people's trust in them might be undermined, and in my opinion, rightfully so. If you are putting people's lives in danger, then the people who are associating themselves with your organization should probably watch their backs. Right now, there's not a lot of information sharing between NGOs about compromises. There aren't a lot of public reports. There aren't a lot of public admissions, even that there is a problem. And NGOs frequently just don't even know where to start with this sort of thing. Which brings us to Lenin and what is to be done. You will notice that my talks frequently bring us to Lenin for some reason. And you basically have two options.
Right, so I was feeling mean when I wrote this slide, and these aren't the only options, but it pretty much boils down like this. So you may be one of the groups that has been mentioned in this talk. If you aren't, then the chances are that your organization has been targeted and or compromised, and you simply haven't noticed because you're not adequately looking, or your organization doesn't piss off people with this sort of capability. And then, of course, someone pointed out right before the talk, they were like, well, there's a third option, which is that someone's organization has been compromised and they're simply not talking about it. And I was like, oh, yeah, so three options. But this is sort of basically it. And I mean, like, this is borne forth by the sort of statistics on news organizations.
So let's talk a little bit about what you can do, depending on who you are, because you probably just listened to this talk and now you are feeling deep, deep despair. What I'd really like for funders to do is to give money to NGOs to bring their security up to basic hardened enterprise standards. Corporations that have been worried about nation-state attackers going after their intellectual property have been thinking about this problem for a very long time. And they have both sort of standards of behavior and also IT and security standards in place that they implement in order to mitigate these kinds of problems. So it's not like NGOs have to reinvent the wheel. They just have to go out into InfoSec land and figure out what private corporations have been doing all this time. And what they should really start with is what's called a needs assessment. So you hire a bunch of security professionals to come in and just figure out what the problem is, because right now you don't even know what you don't know. And this is going to be kind of scary and expensive, but I would really like for funders to be willing to pay for it and to understand that you can't even begin to solve this problem at NGOs until that needs assessment happens. It is possible that you will be approached by people who will tell you that they can do this in their free time, and that they can do it for cheap. And that it's going to cost you, hardly any money, and they're going to do it for you. Chances are that you're not going to get a very good needs assessment this way. Frequently, even in NGO land, you get what you pay for. NGOs, I would like for you to pay for an assessment of your IT practices. If you have to go to funders in order to ask to make this money happen, do it. Funders are willing to listen. Hire security professionals, and again, I warned you about the people who are willing to work for NGO money. Pay them real InfoSec money. It's going to keep your people alive. It's totally worth it. And also understand that sexiness in funding comes and goes. A few years ago, there was lots of funding out there from the US government and the Swedish government and the Netherlands and Google for working on censorship circumvention. Then there was lots of money for working on end-to-end encrypted communications. Then there was lots of money for rapid response. But let me tell you, when that new wave of sexiness hits, then all the old stuff suddenly runs out of money. So governments are not this never-ending tap where, green bills just rain down from the sky. So have a plan for when the money runs out. And finally, if there are any security professionals in the audience, give support and advice to NGOs. Maybe not so much that you spend all of your time doing it and you burn out, but introduce them to your friends who might want to work for them. Give them some advice about vendors. Put them in touch with your contacts. If you're a security professional, you've actually spent a lot of time sort of separating the wheat from the chaff, identifying the products that are snake oil. Use all of this experience and give NGOs your advice, because they really need it. And finally, so Morgan and I gave a talk at the Enigma conference back in January, where we talked about this problem and sort of how it relates to the security world and security professionals. And this is sort of part 2 of this talk. Shortly after us, Rob Joyce, the director of Tailored Access Operations at the NSA, gave his talk. And here's what he had to say about hardening your enterprise so that the NSA can't sneak on in. He said, if you really want to protect your network, you have to know your network, including all of the devices and the technology on it. In many cases, we know networks better than the people who designed and run them. So have some introspection into your network, because if you don't, governments will.
Right, so I wanted to sort of give thanks to a lot of the people who had done a lot of the work which was sort of presented during this talk. And so, Claudio Garnieri, Bill Marchek, Marian Marchilek, John Scott Railton, and Katie Kleemoller. We'll just say thank you to them. And questions? Are there any people? Yes. Sure.
I fall in the category of not really important enough to attract state government. I do a lot of work. I'm sorry. I do a lot of work defending anonymous speakers, often international speakers who are defending their rights against subpoenas here in the States. On the one hand, I would attract enough interest in the people who they're defaming, allegedly are, cult corporations, people who certainly be willing to hire a hacker to do a fishing expedition. You give the example, you get an invitation with a Word document that you as Eva, realized it must be a phishing thing. But if I didn't look at inquiries I get from weirdos, I'd be out of work. I mean, this is my job, is defending people and trying to sort through who has a case and who doesn't have a case. To do that, I'm like, okay, send me the document, send me the complaint, send me the whatever, let me take a look at it. I can't imagine living in a world where even if I had, you on retainer to send you every suspicious document to look at, time is of the essence for me to figure out whether I can represent people. Is there a solution? You don't have to do it, but what do I do?
So this is actually a problem that is actually at the very heart of the matter. Like the other day on Twitter, I saw one of the great and the good of the security community say, like, make sure you have updated software, don't click on stuff. Like, all security advice is this. And I was like, whoa, that's really great. You realize my day job is looking after an organization of journalists. So like their entire job is to like open stuff that people send them. Like your advice is solid, actually. It will protect people. However, it means that people can't do their jobs. And so I mean, there's
Google Drive.
I mean, yeah. There's stuff that goes a lot deeper than this, right? Like, I mean, Google Drive is a difficult problem for lawyers. I mean, depending on how you have sort of, you may have policies in your organization about where you can store documents and how you can open them and that sort of thing. But I mean, there are sort of solutions. For instance, I commonly recommend to people that if they're suspicious about attachments, they should upload them into Google Drive and open them there, because it renders in Google Drive and not on your computer. If it doesn't open in Google Drive, you should probably not try to open it on your computer. I mean, there's lots of different pieces of advice that one could give, but in this specific case. Yes. Dinah?
Hi, I'm Dinah Pokemter from Human Rights Watch, and since we were figured prominently in your illustrations, I feel like I have to add a little information, one of which is following our hacking by China, we invested $200,000 into doing network monitoring. And you have to understand that one of the reasons that Human Rights Watch didn't write a report about it is because nobody necessarily is interested. But we asked Morgan, and you guys, type of guys, can write about it. All you have to do is come and ask. So don't impute negative necessarily that everybody's trying to hide things. Sometimes it's just a question of capacity. Since we're human rights experts, we're not technical experts. Second, yes, we would love funders to step forward with a few $100,000 to help us, but they aren't interested. It's really difficult. There is right now a barrier of understanding